Hello and welcome to Williams Mullen's Trending Now, an IP podcast, a legal podcast focused on providing innovative companies and investors with important and timely information concerning intangible assets such as patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. I'm your host, Courtney, and today I'll be joined by my colleague, Janet, a partner in our intellectual property practice group here at Williams Mullen, to discuss an interesting topic, trademark congestion and depletion. Janet, I know that this is a topic you really enjoy speaking about, and I look forward to discussing this with you today.
Well, thank you, Courtney, for your introduction. And you're right, I really enjoy speaking about this topic, mainly because I think it's a really practical topic, and it's something that I think universally affects or can affect a brand owner. And I'll just start by saying that I think this is a topic that has a bit of perhaps mythology. I think it's something that brand owners are aware of and struggle with, but I'm not always sure that brand owners know that they can put a name to it, or that there are actually people out there taking a look at this and trying to find ways to deal with it. I think aside from infringement and unauthorized use of trademarks, this may be the number 2 frustration of brand owners, or the number 2 concern of brand owners for which they might want some additional information. And what I'm hoping to touch on today is really just conveying that this notion of trademark congestion and depletion, talking about what it is, also discussing what some of the studies of these topics have found and generated, and what are some things that brand owners can consider as they try and either manage or deal with or maybe even combat some of the effects of trademark depletion and congestion. So it's a lot to manage, it's a lot to think about, a lot to deal with for sure, but I'm hoping that we can leave here with some very practical advice for our brand owners out there.
Well, thanks, Janet. This sounds really interesting. Maybe we should start from the beginning, and maybe you could kind of give us an overview of what exactly trademark congestion is and how it is different from trademark depletion.
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really good starting point. And congestion and depletion, as similar or maybe as conceptually related as they may be, they're actually quite different. Trademark congestion is the phenomenon where a particular mark is already claimed to be owned by a party, and going forward or subsequent, it's claimed to be owned by an increasing number of trademark owners. So let me clarify that. You may have a particular mark, and it's registered for, say, a particular service, banking services. So as the owner of that mark for banking services, you may feel as though I've got a pretty distinctive mark. I know what my mark promotes. I think I feel pretty confident about myself in my marketplace. And as time goes on, you find that more and more parties are using that mark perhaps for different goods and services. And those different goods and services are actually quite different from what you do, banking services. But with the onset of time and with the onset of more and more parties entering the marketplace, you realize what was once different as a good or service is now coming perilously close to what you're offering. So eventually there is very, very little room for other parties to, one, enter the marketplace and use that mark for something that they might want to promote under the mark. And also, as that party who initially, let's say, used or registered the mark for banking services, you may find over time that your mark is actually not as distinctive or memorable or not as unique as it once was. So congestion is really where a particular mark is owned by an increasing number of owners, many of whom are unrelated, and there ultimately becomes very little room for new entrants to start using that mark for different goods or services, or there may be no different goods or services for which you can use that mark.
That sounds like a tough position to be in. So then could you explain a little bit how trademark depletion differs from congestion?
Absolutely. So congestion is where you have one mark that's taken up for sort of the whole slew of goods and services that a party might use to promote the mark with. Depletion is where there are a decreasing number of trademarks that are unclaimed by a particular owner, or another way to say that is that there are just fewer and fewer words available for use as trademarks. So one way to think of this is that the supply of words that might be available for someone to use as a trademark is essentially finite and exhaustible. Many scholars and many observers have likened this to something similar to natural resource depletion. And I think for many brand owners out there, there's a thought that, the whole world is really, other than marks that are very, very well-known or perhaps famous, I should have a relatively broad landscape of marks available to me to use. I'm sort of starting very broadly, and then through my research and through my, diligence efforts, I'm going to narrow that to, what is distinctive, what is clear by diligence standards, and what we as a brand owner, want to convey. But with depletion, your starting point very often is much more restricted or discrete than what you might have originally thought.
Thanks, Janet. I think it might be helpful for our listeners if we could provide some real-world examples or helpful facts about trademark depletion and congestion.
Absolutely. And I think one reason, again, why I love to discuss this topic is that it's something that comes up a lot, I think, for a lot of brand owners out there, and I think for a lot of our clients, where clients believe, we spent all of this time developing this mark or researching this mark or spending creative time investing in coming up with something that we think is very special and compelling, only to find out, perhaps in the United States and in other jurisdictions, that the mark is actually being used by someone else for either the same or similar goods or services, or something that's commercially too close. So I'll just share some interesting facts. 81% of the 1,000 most commonly used English words in the United States have been registered as single-word trademarks. 62% of the 10,000 most commonly used English words have been registered as single-word trademarks. And of many of the words that are available for trademarks, a great majority of them either carry negative consequences, or they're just ones that, as a brand owner, just are not suitable for use as a trademark for whatever reason. Another example is more than half of surnames that are widely used in the United States have been registered as trademarks, and whole entire industries such as cosmetics, breweries, and others are finding it really, really difficult to identify viable marks. So it's definitely an issue. I think that, again, it can be a point of frustration. So I want to share this with brand owners so that part of this is to convey you're not alone. If you've come up against this issue, it's not just a myth, it's something real, and you're not alone. So it's something you want to consider as you go about your brand development, your brand evolution, and your brand management.
Well, Janet, those figures are really compelling. So do you have any other information to provide about how this can impact brand owners?
Absolutely. So there can be a host of implications with trademark congestion and depletion. And I'm going to list a few. They're not in any hierarchical order, and I think different brand owners may be affected differently or more severely by any of these issues that I'm about to mention. But one issue is that very often, because of congestion or depletion, you as a brand owner may not be able to use or apply to register your first choice of mark. So you may be resorting to your second choice or your less effective choice or your less sought after choice. So with that comes the notion that you're not picking what you think is absolutely the best fit for your brand. And you also have to, I suppose, bake into your mark process some flexibility. You have to be prepared to resort to your second choice. So if you were really thinking that your first choice was really it and that's all that you were going to do, you may need to second guess that and have some room to maneuver when it comes to mark selection. There's also been a reported increase in likelihood of confusion refusals before the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Trademark congestion and depletion ultimately are really about how there is an increase among brand owners using essentially the same mark or the similar mark. It's just a proliferation, really, of mark use and mark application. And with that, you can imagine on the prosecution side, there is just a significant increase in confusion refusals. There's also concern about the erosion of distinctiveness, especially among non-famous marks. I think if you're a mark owner that has a very, very well-known and famous mark, perhaps these things don't affect you. Congestion and depletion perhaps don't affect you as much. But I think the majority of brand owners, especially those who are just entering the market, have marks that we might consider, although very effective, may not be very, very well known. And so with these issues of congestion and depletion, there is concern that your mark is not going to be as distinctive, or that there is some erosion or dilution of the memorableness of your mark. There's also increased pendency of application time before the United States Patent and Trademark Office. There's also concern about how much integrity the USPTO register has if many different marks that are really maybe not truly distinguishable are being granted registration. And there's also just generally increased time and cost for your due diligence. And I think, going back to a point I mentioned, that these impacts of congestion and depletion, research has shown that it disproportionately affects those who are new entrants into the market. Again, if you're a mature brand owner and you already have a fair amount of goodwill in your mark out there in the marketplace, perhaps these things are less of a concern for you. But certainly if you are either new to a mark or you're maybe a well-known brand owner starting with a new mark, these are things that may affect you more so than others.
Thanks, Janet. That is a lot to think about. Do you have any advice that you would give to our brand owners out there given this landscape?
Absolutely. I think just as a general matter, I think it's important to take your due diligence seriously before you commence with use of a mark and applying to register. I think in the past, there was this notion that if I'd been using a mark for a fair bit of time, I feel comfortable with just, proceeding to file, or I think that I will, maybe just launch with my mark, and if something happens, I will just, sort of cease using my mark and just deal with it then. What I would say is to take your diligence very seriously and to invest in due diligence prior to use and registration, because the marketplace and because the USPTO register is so much more crowded, it may be much more difficult to casually get a sense of what the landscape is. So definitely invest in quality, thorough due diligence. I would also say it's important when you have a mark that you really love to have some secondary considerations. I think this is a consideration separate and apart from congestion and depletion for sure. This is just a general best practice that you leave yourself open with some choices. Maybe you have marks 1, 2, and 3, or you have a way of going back to the drawing board. I know some brand owners have a library system where they clear several marks at once, and depending on the consumer reaction with the launch, or depending on the internal reaction to the selected mark, there are marks that have already been cleared within this library or this pool that the brand owner can go back to. So I would just say be flexible and have some backup choices. Also for applications, I would say be prepared for longer horizons and potentially an increased frequency of refusals. It may be that you have a registration for something, say a print version of something, and now you want to file for the same mark, perhaps an electronic version of something, and you're thinking, well, I should be on pretty stable ground here. I'm filing for something that's already registered, something very, very similar, and you may find that you get some sort of likelihood of confusion refusal for your same mark just presented in a different medium or different format. And you may find that the landscape has changed. The registries just become more crowded. So I would just be prepared to invest in longer timelines and, more financially in terms of potential confusion refusals. And also just think ahead to, if you really want to be distinctive, what is the best way to do that? And finally, if you have any thoughts about filing for a mark or conducting diligence or sort of moving forward with a mark, I would say act early. I think waiting to come off the sidelines to file an application or conduct that diligence or use that mark may hurt you. So I think as best you can, try and make your brand decisions as early and as decisively as you can so that you're not caught with any negative implications that may or may not arise with congestion and depletion.
Thank you, Janet. That was so helpful. Some great practical advice. And that will wrap up our discussion on trademark congestion and depletion. Thank you again, Janet, for joining me on Trending Now, an IP podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us. You can also visit our intellectual property practice page at williamsmullen.com/IP. There you can find out more about our team as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening, and until next time.